Dawn breaks over the Sinai Desert. April 23, 1916. 5,000 British and Anzac cavalry thunder across the sand toward a tiny oasis fortress called Qatia. Inside, 700 Ottoman soldiers wait with 2 machine guns and a determination that will shock an empire. The garrison commander, Qatia Bey, stands on the crumbling mud-brick wall. The ground trembles beneath his feet. The morning sun glints off thousands of drawn sabers. His men are in position, fingers on triggers, watching the wave of horses and steel bearing down on them. At exactly the right moment, when the cavalry is close enough that every bullet will find a target, Qatia Bey drops his hand. The oasis erupts in fire. Horses go down in rows. Men are thrown from their mounts. The magnificent charge dissolves into chaos and carnage within seconds. The machine guns traverse methodically, left to right to left, cutting down everything that moves. The attack breaks apart like a wave hitting rocks. This is the defense of Qatia. And what you're about to witness is how 700 men stopped the British advance across the Sinai for weeks. They were riding into a carefully designed death trap, and the man who built it was about to teach them the most expensive lesson of the entire campaign. To understand why 5,000 British soldiers were charging across a desert most people had never heard of, you have to understand what the Great War had become by 1916. 2 years earlier, when the guns first thundered across Europe, everyone thought it would be over by Christmas. Quick, decisive, glorious. Instead, it became a meat grinder. The Western Front turned into a 400-mile scar across France and Belgium. Men died for yards of mud. Entire generations were fed into battles like Verdun and the Somme. But the war didn't stay in Europe. When the Ottoman Empire joined Germany and the Central Powers in late 1914, the entire Middle East exploded into conflict. Britain was suddenly fighting for control of territories from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula. And the Sinai Peninsula became the key to everything. This narrow desert strip was the land bridge between Africa and Asia, the ancient highway of empires. It was the buffer protecting the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to India and her Eastern Empire. If the Ottomans seized the canal, they could cut Britain's connection to the east and turn the entire war. The Ottomans had tried once in early 1915, bringing an army to the canal's edge. The attack was repulsed. Now it was Britain's turn to advance. Their strategy was simple: use overwhelming force to sweep aside the small Ottoman garrisons scattered across the desert. Mobile warfare, fast cavalry charges, quick victories. The British had spent the first months of 1916 building up their forces in Egypt, bringing in troops from Australia and New Zealand who'd survived Gallipoli. They stockpiled supplies, trained for desert warfare, and mapped every oasis across the Sinai. By April, they were ready. One by one, the isolated Ottoman outposts fell. Some garrisons fought briefly before withdrawing. Others surrendered without firing a shot. The British cavalry swept across the desert like a conquering tide. Their maps showed only one significant obstacle remaining: a small oasis fortress called Qatia. Intelligence reported it as lightly defended. 700 men, maybe 800 at most. No artillery. Limited supplies. The British allocated 5,000 men to the task. It was overkill, but the commanders wanted to send a message. While the British planned their unstoppable advance, one Ottoman commander was preparing to make them pay for every inch. His name was Qatia Bey, and he had a plan that would change everything. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most incredible defensive stands, hit that subscribe button right now. We're bringing you the battles that changed the world, the stories that deserve to be remembered. Your support keeps these videos coming. Qatia wasn't much to look at. British scouts reported it was barely a fortress. Some mud-brick buildings clustered around a well, a few trenches, nothing that couldn't be overrun in an hour. But wars aren't won on maps. They're won by the men holding the ground, and the 700 soldiers at Qatia weren't going anywhere. Qatia Bey was an experienced Ottoman officer who'd fought in the Balkan Wars. He understood tactics, logistics, and most importantly, his enemy. The British had momentum, numbers, and confidence bordering on arrogance, and that arrogance was something he could use. His garrison wasn't elite. They were regular infantry, a mix of Turkish regulars and local Bedouin auxiliaries who knew the desert intimately. Some were veterans. Others were barely trained conscripts. They didn't have artillery, they didn't have reinforcements, they didn't even have enough ammunition for a prolonged battle. If the fighting lasted more than a few hours, they'd run out of bullets. What they had was preparation, and in defensive warfare, preparation can be worth more than numbers. For weeks, the garrison at Qatia had been digging. Every trench was positioned to provide cover while offering clear fields of fire. Every position created overlapping zones where attackers would face bullets from multiple directions. The well was protected behind multiple defensive layers. An attacking force would have to fight through 3 separate lines to reach it. And without that well, an army couldn't sustain itself in the Sinai. Qatia Bey had only 2 machine guns. 2 against 5,000 men, but he'd positioned them with the care of a chess master. Each gun covered one of the main approaches. Each had been pre-sighted on specific kill zones where cavalry would be most vulnerable. The gunners had spent hours practicing their movements, memorizing the timing and angles. The fortress layout was deliberately compact. Every defender could see and support the positions on either side. If one section came under heavy attack, men could shift to reinforce it within seconds. The soldiers knew the odds. They'd heard about the British cavalry sweeping across the Sinai. They'd heard about other garrisons overrun in minutes. They knew reinforcements weren't coming, but they also knew something the British didn't appreciate. In desert warfare, the defender holds almost every advantage. Water, shade, prepared positions, intimate knowledge of terrain. The attacker has to cross open ground in killing heat with no cover. Everything depended on timing. Fire too early, and the bullets would fall harmlessly into the sand. Fire too late, and the cavalry would be in the trenches. Qatia Bey was betting 700 lives on getting it exactly right. Qatia Bey walked among his men in the days before the British arrived, checking preparations, offering quiet encouragement. He didn't give speeches about glory or empire. These were professional soldiers who understood their job: hold the position, make the enemy pay, survive if possible. As dawn broke on April 23rd, the 700 men of Qatia were ready. They'd stored ammunition in protected dugouts. They'd rationed their water carefully. They'd said their prayers, Muslim and Christian fighting side by side as they'd done throughout the Ottoman Empire for centuries. And then they waited. Standing in their trenches, watching the eastern horizon, some talked quietly, others sat in silence. A few checked and rechecked their weapons, that universal nervous habit of soldiers before battle. When the dust cloud appeared just after dawn, there was no panic. Just a grim acceptance and a final check of weapons. This was the moment they'd prepared for. The British came in waves. First came the scouts, light cavalry probing for weaknesses, testing the defenses. They rode in fast, circling the oasis at what they thought was a safe distance. They expected token resistance before the defenders fled or hunkered down in terror. Instead, they ran into disciplined fire from concealed positions. Several scouts fell from their horses. The others wheeled back in confusion, racing away to report to their commanders. The British officers adjusted their assessment. This wouldn't be quite as easy as they'd thought. But 5,000 men against 700? The brutal arithmetic hadn't changed. They just needed to hit harder and faster. They ordered the main assault, send in the cavalry in an overwhelming charge. The shock and speed of thousands of horses would shatter any defense. The battle would be over in minutes. The cavalry charge was a sight that would have inspired terror in any normal garrison. Thousands of horsemen forming up in waves, then launching forward across the desert. The sound was incredible, a thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself. Sabers drawn and glinting, officers shouting orders, horses building up to a full gallop. It was the kind of charge that had won battles for centuries, from the plains of Mongolia to the fields of Europe. The shock and awe of mounted warriors, the psychological impact of all that mass and momentum bearing down on defenders. But Qatia wasn't a normal garrison, and this wasn't a normal battle. The age of cavalry was ending, though many officers refused to accept it. Machine guns had changed warfare forever. What worked against spears and muskets didn't work against weapons that could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Qatia Bey stood at his command post, watching the charge develop. he waited. Patience was everything in this moment. He let them come. Closer. Closer. His machine gunners had their hands on the firing grips, fingers on the triggers. The riflemen were aiming at the lead riders. The Bedouin sharpshooters were picking out officers. The British cavalry was at full gallop now, a wall of horses and men bearing down on the oasis. The sound was deafening. The ground shook. At exactly the right moment, Qatia Bey gave the signal. The machine guns opened fire. The effect was devastating. Horses went down in rows. Men were thrown from their mounts. The charge dissolved into chaos. The cavalry tried to press forward, but you can't charge through machine gun fire. You can't inspire horses to run into walls of bullets. The attack broke apart like a wave hitting rocks. Some riders wheeled away, trying to escape the killing zone. Others pressed forward out of courage or confusion. Those who made it closest to the trenches were met by rifle fire from defenders waiting for exactly this moment. The machine guns traversed methodically across their pre-planned arcs of fire. The gunners had trained for this, had practiced these exact movements. Within minutes, the charge was shattered. The desert floor was littered with dead and dying horses, wounded men crawling for cover, the wreckage of what was supposed to be an overwhelming assault. The survivors retreated, shocked and demoralized. The British officers were stunned. This wasn't supposed to happen. Cavalry charges worked. They'd worked throughout history. They'd worked at other Ottoman positions. What was different about Qatia? They regrouped and tried again. Different approach, different angle, trying to find a weakness. The result was the same. Machine guns and disciplined rifle fire turned the open desert into a killing field. The British commanders couldn't believe what they were seeing, so they tried again, and what happened next would turn a simple battle into a bloodbath that would haunt the Sinai campaign. By mid-morning, with 2 failed cavalry assaults and casualties mounting, the British commanders made a tactical shift. If cavalry couldn't break through, dismounted infantry would do the job. They'd advance in skirmish lines, using what little cover the desert offered. The infantry advance was slower, more methodical, and more dangerous for the defenders. These were professional soldiers who knew how to move under fire, who could bring their own firepower to bear. The battle became a grinding exchange of fire. The heat was unbearable now. The sun had climbed to its zenith, turning the Sinai into an oven. Temperatures soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. British soldiers, weighed down with equipment designed for European climates, suffered terribly. Some collapsed from heat exhaustion before reaching the Ottoman lines. Others pushed forward, driven by discipline. The defenders had advantages: shade from their fortifications, water from the well. They could rotate men through to rest and hydrate. And they had the psychological advantage of fighting from prepared positions. But the Ottomans had a hidden crisis. Ammunition was running low. Every shot had to count. Qatia Bey moved between positions, personally checking ammunition stocks, redistributing what little remained. He prioritized the machine guns and the critical defensive points. Some positions were told to hold fire unless the enemy got dangerously close. The British infantry kept coming, wave after wave, trying to find a weak point, trying to overwhelm through sheer persistence. They'd advance, take casualties, fall back to regroup, and advance again. By noon, the British brought up their artillery. Not much, just a few field guns, but enough to start making a difference. The gunners began pounding the mud brick walls. Shells exploded against the fortifications, sending up plumes of dust and debris. The walls began to crumble. This was what the British had been waiting for. With breaches opening in the walls, they could launch a decisive assault. The battle was entering its critical phase. They launched another massive assault, concentrating on the breached sections. Infantry rushed toward the openings. The fighting became desperate, chaotic, and brutal. British soldiers made it through one major breach, pushing into the defensive trenches, engaging in hand-to-hand combat with Ottoman defenders. For a terrifying moment, it looked like the defense might collapse. The British had penetrated the outer ring. They were inside the fortress. Officers were shouting orders, calling for more men to push through the gap. But Qatia Bey had planned for this. He'd kept a reserve force positioned to counterattack any breakthrough. Now he unleashed them. Ottoman soldiers charged into the breach from the flanks, hitting the British penetration from two sides. The fighting became savage, intimate, the kind of close-quarters combat that leaves no room for mercy. Bayonets and rifle butts. Entrenching tools used as weapons. Men grappling in trenches too narrow for more than a few fighters at a time. The battle for the breach lasted nearly an hour. Bodies piled up, the sand turned dark with blood. Slowly, yard by yard, the Ottoman counterattack pushed the British back. It cost them dearly. Good men died holding that breach. But they held. The British were forced back out of the gap, back into the open desert, leaving their dead behind. The assault had failed. The British commanders realized with growing horror that they were running out of options. They'd thrown cavalry at the position. They'd sent in infantry. They'd used artillery. And 700 Ottoman soldiers were still fighting. The afternoon wore on. More assaults were launched and repulsed. The Ottoman defenders were exhausted, running on nothing but willpower. The British were equally exhausted, demoralized by the mounting casualties and the stubborn resistance of a garrison that was supposed to have been swept aside hours ago. By late afternoon, the British commanders faced a decision that would define careers and shift strategies. They could commit everything to one final assault, throw every remaining man at the fortress, and try to break through by pure weight of numbers. But the cost would be horrific. Already, hundreds of their men lay dead or wounded in the desert heat. Or they could withdraw, accept that 700 Ottoman soldiers had stopped 5,000 of the British Empire's finest, admit that their intelligence had been wrong and their assumptions dangerously naive. Withdrawing meant admitting defeat, something British officers were trained never to do. It meant questions from superiors about tactics and leadership. But continuing meant potentially losing their entire assault force, turning a defeat into a disaster that would cripple the entire Sinai campaign. If the British attacked one more time, they might break through. Or they might be destroyed trying. Everything hung in the balance. The decision was made, not with triumph, but with bitter pragmatism. The position wasn't worth the cost. Orders were passed down the line. Stretcher bearers moved forward to collect the wounded. The assault units began to pull back. Inside the fortress, the Ottoman defenders watched in disbelief. They'd fired their last magazines. Between all 700 men, they had maybe a few dozen rounds left. The machine guns were down to their final belts. If the British had launched just one more assault, the defense would have collapsed within minutes. But they didn't know, and so they withdrew. As the dust settled and the sound of boots and hooves faded, an eerie silence fell over Qatia. After hours of constant gunfire, explosions, and screaming, the sudden quiet was almost painful. The defenders emerged from their trenches slowly, cautiously, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. They'd held. Against impossible mathematics, against overwhelming firepower, they'd held. The battlefield told the story in brutal numbers. British dead and wounded littered the desert floor. Later estimates would put their casualties at over 300. Dozens of horses lay dead in the sand. The approaches to Qatia looked like a graveyard. The Ottoman casualties were comparatively light. Dozens killed, dozens more wounded, but nothing like the butcher's bill the British had paid. Qatia Bey walked among his men, checking on the wounded, organizing burial details for the fallen, ensuring that the defenses were restored in case the British returned. But deep down, he knew they wouldn't. They'd been bloodied too badly. That night, as the survivors tried to process what they'd accomplished, they could hear the British camp in the distance. The sounds of an army licking its wounds, evacuating casualties, and trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. If you found this story as incredible as we did, do us a favor and share this video. History like this deserves to be known, and you can help spread these stories to people who love learning about the battles that shaped our world. Drop a link in your group chats, on your social media, wherever. Let's make sure the defense of Qatia isn't forgotten. The strategic impact of Qatia rippled across the entire Sinai campaign. The British advance ground to a halt. Their commanders had to completely rethink their strategy. You couldn't just charge across the desert anymore. Every fortress, no matter how small, had to be treated as a potential death trap. The delay bought the Ottomans critical time. Weeks that allowed them to reinforce other positions, to dig more trenches, to build more fortifications. The Sinai went from being a highway that British cavalry could sweep across to being a contested battleground where every mile was paid for in blood. For the British, Qatia became a cautionary tale, a reminder that overconfidence and poor intelligence could turn a simple tactical objective into a strategic disaster. The cavalry, that arm of warfare that had dominated battlefields for millennia, had been proven obsolete by machine guns and prepared defenses. For the 700 men who'd held that oasis fortress, there was no parade, no medal ceremony, no triumphant return home. Most stayed at their posts, knowing the British would return eventually with a larger force. But for one day, for one impossible stand, they'd done something extraordinary. Today, Qatia is barely a footnote in most histories of the First World War. The big narratives focus on the Western Front, on Verdun and the Somme, on Gallipoli. The Sinai is mentioned briefly, if at all. The oasis itself has moved on, modernized, left its moment of violence behind. Modern buildings stand where trenches once cut through the sand. The well that was worth dying for in 1916 is just one water source among many. But for one day in April 1916, 700 men proved something that empires always forget. Numbers don't guarantee victory. Technology doesn't guarantee victory. Sometimes, courage combined with preparation can overcome mathematics itself. The Ottoman flag still flew over Qatia that night. 700 men, exhausted and blooded but unbroken, had stopped 5,000. They'd proven that sometimes the impossible becomes possible. If you want more battles that defy the odds, subscribe and hit notifications. Share this with anyone who loves history's greatest underdog stories. And tell us in the comments what forgotten battle we should cover next. There are so many incredible stories still waiting to be told. 700 against 5,000. The defense of Qatia. The day mathematics failed and courage prevailed.